Wyoming, the winter of 1887. In a narrow alley behind Judge Blackwood's bank, a man and a woman are holding their breath in the dark, just steps away from two armed patrolmen. "Don't move," Silas whispered, his hand pressed lightly against Nell's lips, silencing her before she could make a sound. The glow of a lantern swept across the shadows where they stood pinned together. Nell's heart pounded so hard she was certain the men outside could hear it. One wrong step, one stray sound, and both of them would hang in the town square before the week was out. But Nell wasn't afraid. She'd already lost everything once. And this time, she wasn't backing down, not even if it cost her life. So what pushed a quiet schoolteacher to break into the very bank that had taken everything from her, and the mysterious rancher who'd pulled her from the flames that first terrible morning? Who was he really? Let's go back to the day it all began. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. The wind came off the mountains like something with teeth. It had been 3 days since the last thaw, and the snow around Nell Vance's cabin had frozen into a hard crust that cracked under boots like breaking glass. She heard the horses before she saw them. 4 riders, coming up the frozen ruts of the road, their breath and their mount's breath rising together in the cold morning air. Nell set down the kettle she'd been filling from the rain barrel and watched them come. She already knew who they worked for. Everyone in that stretch of Wyoming knew Judge Blackwood's men on sight, the way you knew a storm cloud before the rain hit. The lead rider was a big man named Cutter, with a face like a fist and a voice that carried. He didn't bother getting down from his horse. "Eleanor Vance, you're behind on your husband's note. 60 days past due. We're here to collect." "There is no note," Nell said. Her voice didn't shake. Arthur never borrowed a dime in his life. Cutter smiled, like he'd heard that 100 times before. Because he had, he swung down off his horse, and the other 3 followed. They didn't ask again. They went straight past her, into the cabin, and started carrying things out into the yard. Her chair, her trunk, the little writing desk Arthur had built her the year they married. Nell followed them out, and that was when she saw the crate of books. Her school books, the primers she'd used to teach every child in town who couldn't afford the schoolhouse fees, and plenty who could. Cutter pulled a match from his coat pocket. "No," she said. Just that. No begging in it. Just the word. Flat and hard. He struck the match anyway and dropped it in the crate, and the pages caught fast in the dry, cold air. Nell stood there in the snow and watched 12 years of her life curl black at the edges. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that. She stood with her arms folded and her jaw set, and something in her chest went quiet and cold, like a door closing. That was when the 5th rider came around the bend. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Silas Thorne rode a big roan gelding, and he sat it like a man who'd been born on a horse, easy and still. He took in the scene in about 2 seconds. The burning crate, the furniture scattered in the snow, 4 armed men and 1 woman standing alone against all of them. He didn't say a word. He just drew. The Colt came out of the holster so fast that Cutter's men didn't have time to do more than flinch. Silas didn't fire it. He didn't need to. He just held it level and quiet, and let the 4 of them look down the barrel and understand what would happen if any hand moved toward a gun. "Get back on your horses," Silas said. First words out of him. Low voice. Not loud. He didn't have to be loud. Cutter's jaw worked like he wanted to argue. He looked at the gun, and he looked at the man holding it. And something in Silas's face must have told him this wasn't a fight worth having, because he spat in the snow and mounted up. The others followed. "Blackwood'll hear about this," Cutter said. "Good," Silas said. "Tell him where to find me." They rode off, and the sound of their horses faded into the cold. And then it was just Nell, standing in the ruin of her front yard, and a stranger on a roan gelding looking down at her. "You hurt?" he asked. "No." Her voice cracked a little on the word. The first crack all morning, and she hated it. He got down off his horse, didn't come close, didn't reach for her, just stood a respectful distance and looked at what was left. The smoking crate, the scattered furniture. A woman with nothing left standing in the snow. You got somewhere to go. No, she said again. And this time it came out steadier. I do, he said. Ironwood Ranch. 2 hours ride. You're welcome there. Long as you need. She studied him for a moment. He didn't look like a man who wanted anything from her. He looked like a man who'd seen something ugly and decided, quietly and without much fuss, that he wasn't going to let it stand. That was rarer than kindness. That was conviction. Why, she asked. Because nobody should have to watch their whole life burn and just take it, he said. She almost smiled at that. Almost. As she turned to gather what little could be saved, a small hand tugged at her sleeve. It was Maddie, one of the immigrant children from the edge of town. No older than 7, cheeks red from the cold. The girl pressed something into Nell's palm and darted off before Nell could speak. It was a page, half burned at the corner. The ink smudged but readable. A page from one of Nell's primers, the one with the alphabet, and the little verse about spring. Somehow, in all the chaos, the child had pulled it from the flames and kept it hidden until now. Nell held it against her chest and looked at the smoke still curling up from the crate. They had burned her books. They hadn't burned what she'd taught. She climbed up behind Silas Thorne without another word, and they rode out toward the mountains, leaving the ashes to settle into the snow behind them. Nell woke to sunlight coming through a window she didn't recognize, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then the ache in her hands reminded her. The cold had gotten into her fingers on the ride, deep enough that they'd gone from burning to numb to burning again. And somewhere in that ride, she'd stopped feeling much of anything at all. She was in a small room with whitewashed walls and a quilt heavier than anything she owned. Someone had put her in a clean nightdress. She sat up too fast, and the room tilted, and she had to grip the edge of the bed and wait for it to settle. The door opened without a knock. A woman came in carrying a tray, older, maybe 50, with gray, streaked through dark hair, and the kind of face that had done a lot of living. She set the tray down on the small table by the bed and looked at Nell with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't unkind either. You're awake. Good. Silas was starting to fuss, though he'd never admit it. Where am I? Ironwood Ranch. I'm Cora Higgins. I run the kitchen here, among other things. She poured something hot and dark into a cup and pushed it toward Nell. Coffee. Drink it slow. You've been asleep the better part of a day. Nell wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the heat bite into her fingers, sharp enough to make her wince. Frostbite, Cora said, nodding at her hands. Not bad. You'll keep all your fingers, but you'll want to be careful with them a while. Nell drank the coffee. It was strong and a little burnt, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks. I need to thank him, she said, Mr. Thorne. You'll get your chance. He's out at the north fence, but he'll be back before dark. Man doesn't sit still long. Cora studied her for a moment. You're the school teacher. Word travels fast around here. We heard what Blackwood's men did to your books. Something in Nell's chest tightened at that. The memory of the fire, the smell of burning paper. She set the cup down carefully. They didn't just burn books, she said. They burned 12 years of work. Everything I built for those children. I know, Cora's voice was quiet. This isn't the first time Blackwood's taken something from somebody in this valley. Won't be the last. Either way things are going. She stood up. Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, come find me in the kitchen. We'll get you settled proper. That word settled sat wrong with Nell. The moment Cora left the room, she lay back against the pillow and looked up at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to be settled somewhere by someone else's kindness. She'd spent her whole adult life earning her place, first as a school teacher, then as Arthur's wife, then as a widow who refused to be pitied. She wasn't about to start taking charity now, not even from a man who'd drawn a gun to save her. She was on her feet the next morning, before the sun was fully up. The ranch, in daylight, was bigger than she'd understood the night before. A sprawl of buildings, a barn, corrals, smoke rising from half a dozen chimneys, people moving between them. More people than she expected for a working ranch. Women with children, an old man missing an arm, mending harness by the barn door. A young black man teaching a group of boys how to shoe a horse. Nell stood at the edge of the yard and understood, slowly, what this place was. It wasn't just a ranch. It was a refuge. She found Silas Thorne near the corral, working a young horse on a lead line, his motions slow and patient, talking to the animal in a low, steady voice that didn't carry far enough for her to hear the words. He noticed her before she got close. He always seemed to notice things before anyone expected him to. "Miss Vance," he said, "you should be resting. I've rested enough." She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed against the morning chill. "I want to thank you for what you did." He shrugged, like it wasn't worth mentioning. Wasn't going to stand there and watch. Most men would have. Then most men are wrong. He turned back to the horse, ran a hand along its neck. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. I don't want charity, Mr. Thorne." That got his attention. He looked at her properly for the first time since she'd walked up, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition. "Didn't offer charity," he said. "Offered a place to stay. Same thing, if I'm not paying for it." A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when people try to manage me." He considered that for a moment, still stroking the horse's neck. "Fine. You want to earn your keep. I've got 20 children on this ranch who don't know their letters. Their mothers are too busy trying to keep this place running to teach them. And I sure as hell don't have the patience for it. You want work. That's work." It wasn't what Nell had expected. She'd braced for an argument, for him to insist she rest and heal and let herself be cared for. Instead, he'd handed her exactly what she needed. A purpose. Something that was hers. "I can do that," she said. "Figured you could." He nodded toward the biggest of the outbuildings. "There's a room in there we don't use much. Used to be a bunkhouse. You want it for a schoolroom. It's yours." That afternoon, Nell walked through the empty bunkhouse, running her hands along the rough wooden benches, thinking about how she'd arrange the room, how she'd teach with nothing but a burned page and her own memory of everything she'd once had. It should have felt like starting from nothing. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in weeks. It was 2 days later that the wound on her hand split open again. A shallow gash across her palm she'd gotten hauling wood the day before. Not deep, but stubborn, refusing to close in the cold. She was sitting on the porch of the main house, trying to bandage it herself, teeth gritted, when Silas came around the corner and stopped. "You're doing that wrong," he said. "I'm doing it fine. You're going to have that hand infected inside a week." He came up the steps before she could argue and knelt in front of her. And before she could pull away, he'd taken her hand in both of his. His hands were rough, calloused from a lifetime of rope and leather and cold iron. But the way he handled her was careful, almost tender, turning her palm to the light to look at the cut. She felt her breath catch, unexpectedly, at the contact, at the strange gentleness of a man who'd drawn a gun without blinking 2 days before. "You should let this heal clean," he said, cleaning the wound with a cloth from his coat pocket. "Not force it. I don't have time to sit around and let things heal. Clean, Mr. Thorne? I've never had that luxury." He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. His hands were still holding hers, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable so much as it was full, charged with something neither of them had a name for yet. "You can have that luxury here," he said finally. "Nobody's going to burn anything else of yours while you're on ironwood land. That's a promise." He finished wrapping her hand, slow and precise, and when he tied off the bandage, he didn't let go right away. Just held her hand a moment longer than he needed to, looking at her like he was trying to work something out in his head. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me." He stood, releasing her hand at last. "Just teach those kids their letters. That's payment enough." She watched him walk off toward the barn, and she sat there a long while after, looking at the neat wrap of the bandage, thinking that Silas Thorne was not at all the kind of man she'd expected to find at the end of the worst week of her life. And she thought, too, about how it felt to be handled gently by someone who clearly knew how to be hard when hardness was called for. There was a kind of strength in that gentleness, she decided, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. That evening, she started her first lesson. 20 children crowded onto the bunkhouse benches, and she held up the half-burned page Maddie had saved from the fire and told them that no matter what anyone burned, no matter what anyone took, nobody could burn what was already inside their heads. Words, once learned, belong to you forever. She watched their faces as she said it, and she understood that she wasn't just rebuilding what Blackwood's men had destroyed. She was building something new, on land that had already decided to protect it. 3 weeks into her new life at Ironwood, Nell found herself standing in front of the one thing she'd been avoiding since the day she arrived. Arthur's trunk. It had survived the fire because it had never been in the cabin. Arthur had kept it in the small root cellar behind the house, and in the chaos of that terrible morning, nobody had thought to look for it. One of the ranch hands had gone back a week later, at Silas's quiet instruction, and recovered what could be salvaged from the property. The trunk had come back with a load of Nell's other belongings, and she'd left it sitting in the corner of her room ever since, unopened, because opening it meant facing all the things about Arthur's death she still hadn't let herself feel. He'd died 2 years before, thrown from his horse on a ride into town, or so she'd been told. She'd grieved him the way a woman grieves a husband who was decent and steady and a little distant, missing him in the quiet moments, resenting him in the harder ones for leaving her to manage a life alone. She'd never questioned the story of how he died. There'd been no reason to. She knelt in front of the trunk that evening after the children had gone home, and she made herself open it. Inside were the ordinary things first. His good shirt, a pocket watch that had stopped working years before he died, a stack of letters from his mother, long since passed, and beneath all of it, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into the false bottom of the trunk so carefully that Nell almost missed it, a leather ledger book that wasn't hers and wasn't anything she recognized. She opened it under lamplight, and her whole body went still. Pages of numbers. Names she recognized. Half the families in the valley. Families she'd taught. Families she knew from church and from market day. Beside each name, figures that made no sense at first glance. Columns of debt that grew and grew across the pages, no matter how much was paid against them. And notes in the margins, in Arthur's careful hand. Small observations that took on a terrible weight the longer she read them. Interest recalculated without notice. Principal increased after full payment logged. Payment received, not recorded. It wasn't a record of debts. It was a record of theft, meticulously documented. Page after page of Judge Blackwood's ledgers copied out by hand, alongside Arthur's own notes, cross-referencing what people had actually paid against what Blackwood claimed they owed. Years of it. Arthur must have spent months, maybe longer, gathering this, sneaking access to records he had no business seeing, building a case against the most powerful man in the territory. Nell sat on the floor of her room with the ledger open on her lap and felt something break loose in her chest that she'd been holding shut for 2 years. Arthur hadn't been careless. He hadn't been thrown from a spooked horse on an ordinary ride. He'd been murdered. And she understood that with a certainty that settled into her bones before her mind had even finished working out the logic of it. Blackwood's men had found out what he was doing, and they'd stopped him, and they'd made it look like an accident. And she had spent 2 years quietly grieving a man she thought had simply had bad luck. She didn't cry, not at first. She sat very still, turning pages, watching 2 years of grief curdle into something colder and sharper. It was Cora who found her an hour later, coming to check why the lamp was still burning so late. She took one look at Nell's face and sat down on the floor beside her without a word. You'd sit with someone at a wake. He was murdered, Nell said finally. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Arthur. He wasn't thrown from his horse. He found this. She held up the ledger. He was building a case against Blackwood, and they killed him for it. Cora took the ledger and paged through it slowly, her face growing harder with every line. Lord, she said quietly, this is everyone. This is the whole valley. He never told me. Now the tears came, sudden and hot. 2 years, Cora. I thought he'd left me alone by accident. I was angry at him for it. I was angry at a dead man for dying carelessly, when he'd died trying to save this whole town. And he never told me because he was trying to protect me. Cora put an arm around her shoulders and let her cry, and didn't say anything for a while, because there wasn't anything to say that would make it better. You need to show this to Silas, Cora said eventually. I know. Tonight. Nell wiped her face and looked at the ledger in her lap, at the neat rows of numbers that had cost her husband his life. The grief was still there. She could feel it sitting heavy in her chest. But something else had grown up alongside it, something colder and more useful. 2 years of aimless mourning had just become 2 years of unfinished business. She found Silas in his study, going over accounts by lamplight. And when she set the ledger down in front of him and told him what it was, he went very quiet. He read for a long time without speaking, turning pages slowly, and Nell watched his jaw tighten with every column of figures. This is Blackwood's whole operation, he said finally. Every family he's got trapped. Every note he's rigged. He looked up at her. Your husband did this. He never told me. Her voice cracked slightly. I thought he died in an accident. 2 years. Silas. I've been angry at a ghost for leaving me, and he was murdered trying to save this valley. Silas closed the ledger carefully, like it was something fragile, though it clearly wasn't. I'm sorry, Nell. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, a small shift that meant something larger was coming. Don't be sorry, she said. Help me finish what he started. He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing the request, understanding what it would cost. What kind of enemy they'd be making of Blackwood if they moved against him directly. This isn't enough on its own, he said finally, tapping the ledger. It's a copy. Blackwood will say it's forged. Say your husband was a bitter man, cooking numbers to slander him. We need the original, his master ledger, the one he keeps his real books in, not the one he shows the bank examiners. Where would that be? Bank vault, locked up tight. And Blackwood's the only one with a key. He leaned back in his chair, and Nell watched something calculating settle into his expression, the look of a man already working out a plan. Getting into that vault isn't going to be easy. I don't care how hard it is. Nell's voice had gone flat and certain. All the grief burned out of it and replaced with something harder. Arthur died for this. I'm not going to let it sit in a trunk, gathering dust, while Blackwood keeps robbing this valley blind. Silas nodded slowly, like he'd expected exactly that answer, and respected her more for giving it. Then we go in during the next storm, he said. Blackwood's watchmen thin out when the weather turns bad. Nobody expects trouble in a blizzard. He looked at her, and there was something almost like admiration in his eyes. You understand what you're asking for. If we're caught, it's not a fine. It's a rope. For both of us. I understand. Nell held his gaze without flinching. I've already lost everything once. I'm not afraid of losing it again, if it means finishing what my husband started. Silas reached across the desk and covered her hand with his. Briefly, a gesture that carried more weight than words would have. Then we'll finish it together, he said, outside. The wind had picked up, carrying the first hard edge of a storm building somewhere over the mountains. Nell sat in the lamplight with her husband's ledger between them and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she was moving forward instead of just enduring. The storm came 3 nights later, exactly as Silas had predicted, rolling down off the mountains with a violence that rattled the windows of the ranch house and buried the road into town under 2 feet of fresh snow by midnight. Nell had never done anything like this in her life. She'd spent her days shaping young minds with primers and slate boards, and now here she was, dressed in dark wool and a borrowed coat, riding into town beside Silas Thorne, with her heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. You don't have to come, Silas had said, one last time, as they saddled the horses in the barn. I do. she'd said. It's my husband's proof. I'm not sending you in there alone to finish what he started. He hadn't argued further. She got the sense he respected her too much to keep pushing. And something about that respect steadied her more than any reassurance could have. The town was a ghost of itself under the storm, every window dark, every street buried and silent. Blackwood's Bank sat at the corner of Main Street, a two-story brick building that looked, even in the driving snow, like it had been built to intimidate. Silas led them around to the back alley, where a single watchman usually stood guard. And true to Silas's prediction, the man was nowhere to be seen, likely huddled somewhere out of the wind, never expecting anyone fool enough to be out robbing a bank in a blizzard. How do we get in? Nell whispered, snow stinging her face. Silas didn't answer with words. He pulled a set of picks from his coat and knelt at the back door. And within a few minutes, that felt like an hour to Nell's frayed nerves, the lock gave way with a soft click. Inside, the bank was dark and cold, the storm's noise muffled to a distant roar. Silas moved through it like he'd walked the layout 100 times in his head, which Nell suspected he had. He led her past the teller counter to a heavy iron door at the back, the vault, and there he stopped and studied the lock with the same patient focus he'd used gentling that young horse weeks before. This one's harder, he murmured. It took longer this time. Long enough that Nell found herself watching the front windows for any flicker of movement outside, her pulse thick in her ears. Finally, the vault door swung open, and inside, on a shelf beside stacks of cash and deed boxes, sat a heavy leather-bound ledger, far thicker than the copy Arthur had hidden away. Nell pulled it down and opened it under the light of Silas's shielded lantern, and there it all was. Blackwood's true books, every rigged number, every falsified payment, every family in the valley reduced to a column of manufactured debt. Beside it were smaller ledgers detailing land seized, notes called in early, families driven off property they'd owned outright before Blackwood's men found a way to claim otherwise. This is it, she breathed. This is everything. Copy what you can. Fast, Silas said, handing her paper and a pencil stub from his coat. We can't take the original. He'll know it's gone the second he opens this vault. We need enough copied to match against your husband's book. Nell worked fast, her hand cramping around the pencil, copying key pages while Silas kept watch at the vault door. She'd gotten through nearly a dozen pages when she heard it. Boots crunching in the snow outside. Low voices carried on the wind. A patrol, checking the block despite the storm. Silas went rigid, listening. 2 men, he whispered, coming this way. The ledger. Leave it. We need to hide. He grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the vault, easing the door shut behind them, and led her into a narrow alcove between the vault and the back wall, a space barely wide enough for one person, let alone 2. He pulled her into it anyway, and there was no way to fit without pressing close, her back against the wall, his body shielding hers from the doorway, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the cold air, close enough to hear the tight rhythm of his breathing. Don't move, he breathed, barely a whisper. The front door of the bank creaked open, boots on the wooden floor, unhurried, a lantern's glow sweeping across the walls in slow arcs. Nell held her breath. Silas's hand came up, resting lightly over her mouth. Not forceful, just a silent instruction. And she understood and stayed perfectly still. The light swept closer. She could hear the men talking now, low and bored, complaining about the cold. About a shift, nobody wanted to be walking in this kind of weather. The lantern light brushed the edge of their alcove, and Nell's whole body went taut, certain they'd been found. But the light passed on. The men's voices moved toward the front of the bank, checking the windows, the door, satisfied enough with a cursory, looked that they didn't think to check the narrow gap behind the vault. After a long minute that felt like an hour, the front door creaked shut again, and the boots crunched away into the storm. Silas didn't move his hand right away. In the darkness of the alcove, pressed close together, Nell was aware of everything at once. The smell of leather and gun oil and cold rain on his coat, the solid warmth of him against her, the way her heart hadn't slowed down, even though the danger had passed. His hand slid slowly from her mouth, his fingers brushing her jaw as it fell away. And for a moment, neither of them moved. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close." His voice was rough. He didn't step back. "You did good. Didn't panic. I've had practice not panicking lately." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, barely visible in the dark. "That copying done. Enough of it. I got the key pages, the ones matching Arthur's notes. Then let's get out of here before our luck runs out." They slipped back into the vault long enough for Nell to finish copying 2 more pages. And then Silas eased the vault door shut and locked it behind them, careful to leave no sign it had been touched. They went out the way they'd come, into the howling storm, and didn't speak again until they were well clear of town, the horses fighting through drifts that came up past their knees. It wasn't until they'd put a mile between themselves and Blackwood's bank that Nell let herself breathe easy. And even then, her mind kept circling back to that alcove, to the feel of his hand over her mouth, to the way neither of them had been in any hurry to step apart. Once the danger passed, something had shifted between them in that narrow, dark space, something neither of them had said out loud. But she suspected they both knew it was there now, plain as the copied pages tucked inside her coat. They rode the rest of the way back to Ironwood in silence, the storm swallowing the world around them. And Nell held the proof of her husband's death and her own future pressed close against her chest, and thought that whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The days after the bank fell into a rhythm Nell hadn't expected to find so quickly. Mornings with the children in the bunkhouse schoolroom, chalk dust on her fingers instead of frostbite. Afternoons bent over the copied ledger pages at the kitchen table, matching numbers against Arthur's notes until her eyes ached. Cora kept coffee coming. The ranch kept turning around her, calving season starting up, fences needing mending, the ordinary business of survival that didn't stop just because a woman was trying to bring down the most powerful man in the territory. It was on one of those afternoons, looking for a spare pen in Silas's study while he was out at the north pasture, that Nell found the papers that changed everything. She hadn't meant to pry. She told herself that later, more than once, though it didn't make her feel any less like she'd trespassed somewhere private. The desk drawer had stuck, and when she'd worked it loose, a stack of documents had come with it, spilling across the desk in a fan of official letterhead and careful signatures. She recognized the shape of it before she understood the details. The language of banks and mortgages, the kind of paperwork Arthur used to spread across their own kitchen table. A loan, a large one, secured against the entire Ironwood property, taken out with a bank in Cheyenne 3 weeks earlier, and beneath it, a second set of documents, purchase agreements for debt notes, dozens of them, all originally issued by Blackwood's bank and quietly bought up through an intermediary in the past month. Nell sat down slowly in Silas's chair and read through it all twice, and the second time through, her hands had gone cold. He was buying Blackwood's debt paper. Every note Blackwood held against the families of the valley. Silas was purchasing them one by one, using Ironwood itself as collateral. If this went wrong, if Blackwood caught wind of it, or the plan fell apart before it could be finished, Silas stood to lose the ranch. Not just the ranch, everything it sheltered. Every widow, every orphan, every outcast who'd found a roof and a purpose under his protection. She was still sitting there when she heard his boots on the porch. He came in shaking snow off his hat, and stopped cold in the doorway of the study when he saw her at his desk, the papers spread out in front of her. Something passed over his face, not quite guilt, more like a man caught in the middle of a thing he'd meant to finish before anyone noticed. "You went through my desk," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. The drawer stuck. "I wasn't looking for this." She held up the loan documents, her voice unsteady. "Silas, what is this?" He came into the room slowly and shut the door behind him, like the conversation needed privacy, even though there was no one else in the house. "It's what it looks like," he said. "You mortgaged the ranch, every acre of it." He said it plainly, without flinching, like a man reporting the weather. "Why? Why would you risk everything you've built here? Everything these people depend on. To buy up Blackwood's debt paper. He was quiet for a moment, and Nell watched him choose his words carefully, the way he did most things. Because owning the paper means owning the leverage, he said. Once I hold enough of Blackwood's notes, I can call them due, or forgive them, whichever serves the valley better. It puts the power back where it belongs, not with a man who rigs numbers to keep folks in his debt forever. And if it fails, if Blackwood finds out, before you've got enough leverage to move against him, you'd lose the ranch. Everyone here would lose their home. I know what I stand to lose. His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone taut, like a rope pulled near its breaking point. I've done the math 100 times over. I know exactly what I'm risking. Then why risk it at all? This isn't your fight. Silas, this is mine. Arthur's, not yours. That seemed to land somewhere it hadn't before. He crossed the room and stood at the window, looking out at the snow, his back to her for a long moment before he spoke again. You want to know why? He said, fine. He pulled his shirt collar aside, just enough to reveal a puckered scar along his shoulder, old and pale against his skin, the kind of mark that had healed wrong and stayed that way. 10 years ago, before I built this place up, I worked a small spread not far from here. Blackwood wanted the land. I wouldn't sell. His voice had gone flat. The way a man's voice goes when he's telling a story he's told himself too many times to feel much of anything about it anymore. His men came at night, burned the barn, shot my horses, and when I tried to stop them, one of them put a blade in my shoulder, deep enough that I nearly bled out before my neighbor found me. I lost that land inside a year. Couldn't work it. Couldn't pay. The note Blackwood's bank had rigged against me the same way he's rigged half this valley. Nell felt something in her chest tighten, understanding arriving slow and heavy. I built Ironwood back up from nothing, he went on. Took me years. And every year I watched Blackwood do to somebody else what he'd done to me. Widows, immigrants, anybody with no family close enough to fight back. I told myself someday I'd have enough behind me to do something about it. And I never did, because there was always another season, another reason to wait. He turned from the window to look at her, and there was nothing guarded in his face now. Then you showed up, he said, standing in the snow with your books burning and not a tear on your face. And I thought, if that woman can stand there and refuse to break, I've got no excuse left to keep waiting. So you mortgaged everything you have. For me, not for you, he said it firmly, though the words that followed softened it. For what you represent. For every family in this valley that deserves better than what Blackwood's given them. I didn't do it for revenge. Nell, revenge would have had me putting a bullet in that man years ago. And God knows I've thought about it plenty. He crossed the room, slow, until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. I did it because this world doesn't deserve a woman like you without a place to stand. Not after everything it's already taken from you. Nell felt her throat tighten, and this time she let the tears come. Quiet ones, not the desperate grief she'd carried out of her burned cabin weeks before, but something gentler, something that came from being seen so completely by another person. You could lose everything, she said softly. I already lost everything once, he said. Rebuilt it because I decided it was worth rebuilding. If I lose it again, doing right by this valley, I'll rebuild it again. That's not a sacrifice. Nell, that's just what a man does when he's finally found something worth the risk. She didn't know which of them moved first. Maybe neither of them did. But his hand came up to her face, calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. And for a long moment, they simply stood there, foreheads nearly touching. The weight of everything they'd both survived, settling quietly between them, instead of pulling them apart. We finished this together, she said. All of it, or not at all. Together, he agreed. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady, covering the valley in white. And inside the study, two people who had both been broken by the same man's greed stood a little closer than before. No longer just allies, but something neither of them had a full name for yet, and weren't in any hurry to name. Cora Higgins had run the boarding house kitchen in town for 11 years, before Blackwood's bank had squeezed her out of it, claiming a debt against equipment she'd bought outright a decade before. She'd ended up at Ironwood the way most of them had, with nothing but her hands and her pride. And she'd spent the 2 years since rebuilding a version of herself that didn't flinch anymore when she heard Blackwood's name. It was Cora that Nell went to first with the decoded ledger, because Cora knew every woman in the valley who'd been caught in Blackwood's rigged books, and because Cora had a gift for gathering people quietly, without drawing the kind of attention that got a woman's house burned down. They met in the ranch's root cellar 3 nights running, a dozen women at a time, lantern light throwing long shadows against shelves of preserved vegetables. Voices kept low, even though there was no one for miles to overhear them. Nell laid the numbers out plain. Here is what you were told you owed. Here is what you actually paid. Here is the difference. And here is where it went. The first night, a woman named Ruth Callahan started crying halfway through, not from grief, but from something closer to fury, because the numbers proved what she'd suspected for 2 years and never had the proof to say out loud. Her husband had died owing $400 to Blackwood's bank, according to the note he'd signed, according to the ledger Nell had copied from the vault. The original loan had been for $60, paid off twice over before he died. The balance manufactured entirely out of falsified interest. He worked himself into an early grave, paying off a debt that didn't exist, Ruth said, staring at the page like it might rearrange itself into something less cruel. My children went hungry 2 winters paying off a lie. You're not alone, Nell told her, and told all of them, night after night. Every family Blackwood has touched has a page in this book. He didn't just cheat one of you. He built an entire system on cheating all of you, and systems built on lies fall apart. Once enough people stop believing the lie. The second night, Cora brought her own hands to the lantern light and held them up for the room to see, cracked and calloused and scarred in places from years of hard labor she'd taken on trying to pay down a debt that, as it turned out, had already been paid twice over before she'd ever picked up a scrub brush for Blackwood's men. I worked myself half to death for a number that man invented out of thin air, Cora said, her voice steady, even though her hands shook slightly in the light. I want every one of you to understand something. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't hard times. This was a man deciding our lives were worth less than his profit and building a system to prove it. The room went very quiet after that. What do we do? Ruth asked. Nell had thought about this question longer than any other since she'd first opened Arthur's trunk. She knew what anger alone would accomplish, which was nothing lasting. A town in chaos, and Blackwood's men putting it down hard, the way they always had before. She knew what silence would accomplish, too, which was more of the same. Another generation of families quietly bled dry by numbers nobody dared question. We document everything, she said, every one of you. Write down what you actually paid, when and to who. Match it against your own copies of your notes if you kept them. We're building a case, not a riot. When the time comes, we're going to need proof that holds up in a courtroom, not just anger that burns out in a night. And if Blackwood finds out what we're doing, before we're ready, a younger woman asked, one Nell didn't recognize, thin-faced and nervous, holding a baby against her shoulder. Then we're no worse off than we already are, Cora said flatly. He's already taken everything most of us had to give. What's left for him to threaten? It was a hard truth, but it settled the room in a way soft reassurance wouldn't have. These were women who had already lost their homes, their savings, their husbands in some cases. And there was a strange kind of freedom in having so little left to lose that fear stopped working the way it used to. By the third night, word had spread beyond the women Cora had personally gathered. Farmers who'd lost land came. Quiet men who sat at the edges of the cellar and listened more than they spoke. A blacksmith whose shop Blackwood's bank had seized 2 winters back. An old widow who'd walked 4 miles through the snow because she'd heard there was finally proof of what everyone in the valley had quietly suspected for years. Nell stood in front of that growing crowd of dispossessed and cheated people, and felt something shift in the room. A slow gathering of resolve that reminded her of watching ice break up on a river in spring. Small cracks spreading wider until the whole surface gave way at once. He's built an empire on the belief that none of you would ever compare notes, she told them, that you'd each suffer alone, ashamed, thinking it was your own bad luck or your own failure. He counted on your silence. Every one of you sitting in this cellar tonight is proof that silence is over. Word of the gathering reached town faster than any of them expected, though not through carelessness. It reached Blackwood the way most things reached him, through a paid informant. One of his own clerks who'd overheard two of the boarding house women talking too freely about a meeting out at Ironwood. Blackwood sat in his office that night with the report in front of him and felt, for the first time in a long while, the cold edge of something he wasn't used to feeling, uncertainty. He sent word to his bank the next morning, ordering a full accounting of every note he'd sold off in the past month, and the accounting came back wrong in a way that made his blood run cold. Dozens of his debt notes, quietly purchased through an intermediary he'd never questioned closely enough, all funneling back to the same buyer, Silas Thorne. Blackwood sat with that knowledge for a long time, turning it over, understanding slowly what it meant. Somewhere along the way, while he'd been focused on breaking a schoolteacher and burning her books, the rancher he'd once nearly killed had been quietly buying up the foundation of his entire empire. He called Cutter into his office that afternoon and gave an order that would set the whole valley on fire within the week. Ironwood, he said. I want it burned to the ground before that ledger ever sees a courtroom. They came at night, the way Blackwood's men always did their worst work, riding hard through the dark with torches lit and rifles slung across their backs. 20 men against a ranch that had never been built to withstand a siege. Silas had known it was coming. Word had reached him 2 days before, passed along quietly by a sympathetic clerk in town who'd overheard enough of Blackwood's planning to send warning out to Ironwood. There'd been no time to evacuate everyone, and nowhere safer to send them regardless. Not with Blackwood's reach extending into every corner of the valley. So instead, Silas had spent those 2 days preparing, reinforcing the main house, positioning what few armed men the ranch could muster, making sure every woman and child knew exactly where to shelter when the shooting started. Nell had refused, flatly, to be counted among those sheltering. I can load a rifle as fast as any man here, she'd told Silas, standing in his study with her jaw set the same way it had been set the morning her books burned. I'm not hiding in a cellar while you defend this place. Arthur died trying to stop Blackwood. I'm not going to survive this fight by doing nothing. He hadn't argued long. He'd learned by then that arguing with Nell Vance over her own courage was a losing proposition. And some part of him, the part that had fallen for her somewhere between a bank vault and a mortgage he'd signed, without regret, respected her too much to try and cage her safety at the cost of her dignity. The first torch hit the barn a little after midnight. Nell was in the main house loading rifles at the kitchen table when she heard the shout go up outside, followed almost immediately by the crack of gunfire and the orange bloom of flame lighting up the window. She didn't freeze. She'd promised herself she wouldn't freeze, and she kept that promise, hands steady as she worked the lever on a Winchester and passed it out through the gun port, cut into the barricaded window to one of the ranch hands crouched there. The barn caught fast, hay and dry wood feeding the fire, until it lit the whole yard in flickering orange light, throwing long dancing shadows across the snow. Through the gun port, Nell could see men on horseback circling at the edge of the light, rifles firing toward the house, answered by shots from the barricaded windows and the low stone wall around the well where two of the ranch's outcasts, a one-armed veteran named Dell and a young black cowhand named Marcus, had taken up position with steady, disciplined fire that dropped two of Blackwood's mercenaries before the others learned to keep their distance. Silas moved through the house like he'd been born for exactly this kind of night, checking positions, calling out targets, his voice carrying over the gunfire with a calm that steadied everyone around him. He took a graze along his forearm from a shot that came through a window not properly barricaded, and didn't so much as pause to look at it. Just tied a strip of cloth around it, one-handed, and kept moving. "They're trying to draw us out toward the barn," he called to Nell, ducking low as another volley hit the house. "Trying to split our defense. Then we don't split it," Nell said, passing him a freshly loaded rifle. "Let the barn burn. We hold the house." He looked at her for half a second, something like pride flashing across his face even in the middle of the chaos. And then he nodded and turned back to the fight. The siege dragged on for the better part of an hour, the mercenaries probing at different points around the house, testing for weakness, and finding none that could be exploited, without exposing themselves to the disciplined fire coming from the barricaded windows. Cora had taken up position near the back door, with a shotgun she clearly knew how to use. Her face set in the same hard resolve Nell had seen in the root cellar meetings. And when one of Blackwood's men made a run at the back porch, she put him down without hesitation. It was Marcus, out by the well, who spotted Cutter trying to work his way around the eastern side of the house with 3 other men, aiming to breach the kitchen where Nell and 2 of the older children were still loading rifles. He shouted, a warning that carried over the gunfire, and Silas was moving before the words had fully left the young man's mouth, cutting through the house to the kitchen with his rifle already up. Nell saw the shadow at the window a half second before Silas reached her, and she didn't think. She just moved, shoving the children down behind the heavy kitchen table as glass shattered inward. Silas fired twice through the broken window, and the shadow outside fell back into the snow with a cry that cut off hard. "You all right?" he asked, hauling her up by the arm, checking her over with a fast, urgent glance. "I'm fine, the children here," said the older of the 2, a boy of maybe 12, pale but unhurt, already reaching for the dropped rifle to reload it with hands that shook only slightly. Outside, the tide of the fight was beginning to turn. Whatever Cutter had promised his men about an easy raid on an undefended ranch, the reality of Ironwood's resistance had clearly rattled them. 2 more mercenaries went down under Dell's steady rifle fire from the well, and a third took a wound from Cora's shotgun that sent him screaming back toward the horses. The barn continued to burn, throwing enough light across the yard that Blackwood's remaining men found themselves exposed every time they tried to press closer, easy targets against the flame-lit snow. It was close to dawn when Cutter finally called the retreat, his voice hoarse and furious, the surviving mercenaries pulling back and scattering into the tree line, leaving behind the wreckage of a failed siege, a burning barn, and several of their own dead and wounded in the snow. Nobody at Ironwood cheered. There wasn't much cheer left in any of them after an hour of gunfire and fear. Just a slow, exhausted relief as the shooting finally stopped, and the only sound left was the crackle of the burning barn and the wind pulling smoke up into the graying sky. Nell found Silas out in the yard afterward, watching the barn burn down to its bones, his forearm bleeding through the makeshift bandage. Soot streaked across his face. "We held," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "We held." He looked over at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression, stripped bare by the long night. "You didn't hesitate, back there in the kitchen. Neither did you." He reached out and took her hand, the same careful, deliberate way he'd bandaged it weeks before. And this time, neither of them pretended it was anything but what it was. "Blackwood's not done," he said. "He'll come again, harder. Once he understands this didn't break us. Let him come." Nell watched the barn's timbers collapse inward in a shower of sparks, and felt no fear in the words, only a hard, settled certainty. "We've got the ledger. We've got the town behind us now. Whether Blackwood knows it yet or not, he can burn every barn on this ranch, and it won't change what's coming for him." Silas looked at her for a long moment, streaked with soot and smoke and utterly unbroken. And something in his chest settled into place the way it hadn't in 10 long years since Blackwood's men had first put a blade in his shoulder. and taken everything he'd built. Dawn's coming, he said, nodding toward the horizon, where the black sky had started to soften into gray. Time to finish this. Dawn broke over ironwood the color of an old bruise, purple fading into gray. Smoke from the barn, still climbing thin and gray into a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to clear. Nell stood in the yard watching Silas check the girth on his horse, his forearm freshly bandaged. Soot still ground into the creases of his knuckles. "You should rest," she told him, though she already knew what he'd say. Rest comes after. He swung up into the saddle, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. "Blackwood needs to hear it from me directly. Not from a lawyer, not from a letter, from me, standing in his office, before he has time to hide anything else. Then I'm coming with you." He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing with her about danger somewhere around midnight, when she'd stood at a barricaded window loading rifles with steadier hands than half the grown men on the property. He reached down and offered his good arm, and she swung up behind him on the horse, the ledger and the mortgage papers packed tight in a leather satchel across his back. They rode into town as the sun cleared the ridgeline, past houses just beginning to show smoke from morning fires, past the boarding house where Cora had once run a kitchen before. Blackwood's bank had taken it from her on paper that turned out to be as false as everything else he'd built. Word of the siege had already reached town somehow, the way word always traveled faster than any rider could carry it, and Nell noticed faces appearing in windows and doorways as they passed, watching, waiting, the whole valley holding its breath to see what came next. Blackwood's bank sat on the corner same as it always had, brick and iron and the illusion of permanence. Silas didn't bother tying off his horse properly, just looped the reins over the post and walked through the front door like he owned the place, which, as it happened, he very nearly did. Judge Blackwood was at his desk when they came in, going over a stack of papers, with the unhurried calm of a man who hadn't yet learned that his empire was already collapsing beneath him. He looked up, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the first thin edge of concern, before he smoothed it back into the practiced confidence he wore like a second skin. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I heard there was some unpleasantness out at your ranch last night. Terrible thing. Fires in this kind of weather." "Cut it," Silas said. He crossed the room and dropped the satchel on Blackwood's desk, hard enough to rattle the inkwell. "You know exactly what kind of unpleasantness that was. You sent it." Blackwood's eyes flicked to the satchel, then to Nell standing just behind Silas, her chin up, her eyes steady in a way that seemed to unsettle him more than Silas's anger did. "I don't know what you think you're accusing me of," Blackwood said, "but I'd be careful making claims you can't back up. I've got friends in this territory, Mr. Thorne, judges, marshals, people who'll take my word over a rancher's grudge." "Then let's talk about words," Silas said, and pulled the mortgage documents out of the satchel, laying them flat across Blackwood's own desk. "These are notes. Your notes. The ones you sold off through Harmon and Greaves out of Cheyenne over the past month." Something in Blackwood's face went very still. "I've been buying them up," Silas said, quiet, one at a time. "Same way you built this whole racket. Every note you've got against every family in this valley. I hold most of them now, which means the money you thought you owned, the leverage you thought you had over half this town, belongs to me." "That's impossible," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its steadiness. He reached for the papers with hands that weren't quite as controlled as they'd been a minute before, scanning the transfer records, the signatures, the dates. "You'd need capital. More than any rancher out here, I mortgaged Ironwood," Silas said flatly. "Every acre of it. Bet the whole ranch on the idea that a man who built his fortune on lies would eventually be caught by the truth. Looks like I bet right." Nell stepped forward then and set the ledger down beside the mortgage papers, Arthur's copy and the pages she'd stolen from the vault that snowbound night, laid out side by side like two halves of the same accusation. "You remember my husband," she said, "Arthur Vance. You called it an accident, him getting thrown from his horse. It wasn't. He found this. She tapped the ledger. Every falsified note. Every rigged interest column. Every family you've bled dry with numbers that don't exist outside your own private books. He was building a case against you when your men killed him for it. Blackwood's composure cracked, just slightly, at the mention of Arthur's name. A flicker of something that might have been recognition, might have been guilt. Though Nell suspected a man like Blackwood had long since stopped feeling much of either. "You have no proof of that," he said, but the words came out thinner than before. "I have his notes," Nell said. "I have your vault copy that matches them line for line. I have every woman in this valley ready to testify about what she actually paid against what your ledger claims she owed. And I have a federal marshal already riding this way. Because word travels fast when a town's been waiting years for someone to finally listen." That last part was true, though only just. Silas had sent a rider 2 days before. Once the plan to move against Blackwood had solidified, carrying word to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne about a debt bondage scheme with documentation to support the claim. There'd been no guarantee the marshal would come quickly, or at all. But the bluff landed exactly as Nell intended, because Blackwood's face went the color of old ash. "You can't do this," he said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice had lost all its practiced calm, gone raw and desperate in a way that made him look smaller than the desk he sat behind. "This bank, this town, I built all of it." "You built it on other people's suffering," Silas said, "and now it's done." He pulled one more document from the satchel, the deed transfer he'd had drawn up in Cheyenne alongside the mortgage, the paperwork that would, the moment it was filed with the Territorial Land Office, transfer control of every note. Blackwood had sold into Silas's hands, into a trust administered for the benefit of the very families those notes had been stolen from. "Every family whose debt I hold. Forgiven," Silas said, sliding the document across the desk. "Every acre you've seized on false notes, returned, and every dollar left in your accounts after that goes toward restitution for what your bank's already taken." He met Blackwood's eyes, steady and hard. "I'm not shooting you, Blackwood, though God knows there were nights out at that ranch I wanted to. I'm doing something worse. I'm taking away the only thing you ever actually cared about." "And what's that?" Blackwood managed, though the fight had mostly gone out of his voice. "Power," Silas said simply. "You spent your whole life building a system where people had no choice but to answer to you. Come tomorrow. That system doesn't exist anymore. You'll answer to a federal court, same as anybody else. And there won't be a rigged ledger anywhere in this territory left to save you." Blackwood looked down at the papers spread across his desk, at the mortgage and the ledger and the transfer deed, at the sum total of an empire built on 20 years of quiet theft laid bare in the space of a single morning. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call for his men, most of whom were already scattered or wounded or gone after the failed siege the night before. He just sat there, and for the first time since Nell had known of him, Judge Blackwood looked exactly like what he was underneath all the money and the fear he'd traded on for so long. An old man who'd built his whole life on a lie, watching it come apart at last. "Get out of my bank," he said, though there was no force left behind the words. "It's not your bank," Silas said. "Not anymore." They left him there, sitting alone with the ruins of everything he'd built, spread across his desk, and walked out into a town that was already, in ways neither of them could see yet, beginning to breathe easier under a sky that had finally, after weeks of storm, started to clear. The federal marshal arrived 6 days later, a lean, unhurried man named Tate Whitfield, who'd seen enough corruption across the territory that little surprised him anymore, though even he raised an eyebrow at the thickness of the ledger Nell handed over, and the sheer number of families waiting to testify to its contents. Blackwood was arrested within the week, held first in the town jail, and then transferred under federal guard to await trial in Cheyenne, where the territorial court had jurisdiction enough to handle a case of this size. The trial was set for early spring, giving the valley a long, tense winter to wait and wonder whether justice would actually hold, or whether a man with Blackwood's money would find some way to slip free of it, the way men like him so often did. It was during that waiting winter that Blackwood made his last desperate move. He still had money the courts hadn't yet frozen, money enough to hire a man willing to do ugly work for the right price. And word reached Ironwood 2 days before the trial was set to begin that a hired gun named Royce Malden had been seen in Cheyenne, asking questions about a school teacher scheduled to testify. Silas didn't sleep the night before they left for Cheyenne, sitting up with a rifle across his knees, watching the road. Nell found him there near dawn and sat with him a while without either of them saying much, because there wasn't much left to say that they hadn't already said in the months since a burning crate of books had brought them together. "You don't have to testify," Silas said finally, the same offer he'd made a dozen times over the past week. "Cora can carry enough of it. The ledger speaks for itself." "The ledger's just numbers," Nell said. "It needs a voice behind it, or a jury full of men who've never gone hungry will look at those figures and see nothing but abstractions. I have to be the one to make them understand what those numbers actually cost." He didn't argue further. He'd learned by then that arguing with her conviction was like arguing with weather. They rode into Cheyenne 2 days before the trial, staying at a boarding house near the courthouse, and it was on the second night, walking back from a late supper, that Malden made his move. He came out of the alley beside the courthouse fast and silent, a blade catching the low light of the street lamp, aiming for Nell before Silas had fully registered the shape of him. Silas moved on instinct built from 10 years of hard living, shoving Nell hard enough to send her stumbling clear, and taking the first slash across his own forearm instead of her throat. The fight that followed was ugly and close and fast, nothing like the clean drama of a quick draw. Malden was younger, faster, trained for exactly this kind of work, and he pressed his advantage hard, driving Silas back against the alley wall with a series of strikes that left Silas bleeding from a second cut along his ribs before he managed to get inside the man's guard and drive an elbow hard into his jaw. Nell screamed for help, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the alley, and somewhere down the street a night watchman's whistle answered. But it felt impossibly far away while Silas and Malden grappled in the dark, both men bleeding now, the blade flashing between them in a fight that had nothing clean or heroic about it, just two men trying to survive. It ended when Silas finally got a hand on Malden's wrist and slammed it hard against the brick wall, once, twice, until the blade clattered free onto the frozen ground. And then it was just fists, brutal and close, until Malden went down and stayed down, out cold or close to it, and Silas stood over him breathing hard, blood running freely down his side. Silas. Nell was at his side in an instant, hands pressed against the wound along his ribs, feeling the warmth of blood soaking through immediately. "We need a doctor." "Now I'm fine," he managed, though his voice had gone tight and thin. "You are not fine," she snapped, already pulling his arm across her shoulders, half dragging him toward the boarding house as the watchman finally arrived, whistle still blowing, to find Malden unconscious in the alley and a trail of blood leading toward the street. The doctor who stitched Silas's wound that night told them plainly it had missed anything vital by less than an inch, and that another quarter-inch deeper would have told a very different story. Silas spent that night pale and feverish, and Nell sat beside his bed until dawn, holding his hand the way he'd once held hers, thinking about how close she'd come to losing him the same way she'd lost Arthur, to a blade in the dark, meant to silence the truth. He was well enough, barely to sit in the courtroom. 2 days later, when the trial began, his arm bound tight against his side, his face pale but his eyes steady. The trial itself lasted 4 days. Blackwood's lawyer, an expensive man brought in from Denver, tried every angle he had, questioning the authenticity of the ledger, suggesting Arthur Vance had been a bitter, failed businessman inventing grievances, painting Silas as a rival rancher with a personal vendetta dressed up as justice. It might have worked in another courtroom. against another set of witnesses. But it was Nell's testimony that broke the case wide open. She took the stand on the third day, and instead of leading with numbers or accusations, she reached into her bag and pulled out a pair of work gloves, cracked and stained and worn through at the fingertips. The leather split from years of labor. These belonged to Cora Higgins, she told the jury, holding them up so every man on the panel could see the ruin of them clearly. She wore these scrubbing floors and washing linens for 2 years, working herself past exhaustion to pay down a debt Judge Blackwood's bank claimed she owed. I have her own copy of the original note here. She held up the paper beside the gloves. $60, borrowed to replace a stove that broke in her boarding house kitchen. She paid it back, every cent, within the year, according to her own receipts. Nell set the note down and picked up the ledger page that matched it, according to Judge Blackwood's own private books. That debt had grown to $340 by the time she'd finished paying, through interest that was recalculated in secret, month after month, without her knowledge or consent. She walked the jury through the math slowly, patiently, the same way she'd once taught children their letters, breaking down the rigged compounding, the falsified payment records, the pattern repeated across dozens of families throughout the valley. She held up Ruth Callahan's late husband's note beside the doctored figures that had driven him to work himself into an early grave over a debt that had already been paid twice over. This isn't a case about disputed numbers, she told the jury, her voice steady, carrying clear through the silent courtroom. This is a case about a man who built an empire by making sure the people he cheated never had the proof to speak up and never had anyone willing to listen. If they did, my husband died trying to gather that proof. I'm standing here today because I refuse to let his death be for nothing. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a verdict. Guilty on every count. Fraud, extortion, and though the murder charge against Arthur couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, given how carefully Blackwood's men had staged the accident, the judge made clear in sentencing that the years of documented cruelty were enough on their own to warrant the harshest penalty available. Judge Josiah Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His remaining assets seized to fund restitution for the families he'd cheated. His name struck from every deed and note across the valley that had once borne his mark. Outside the courthouse, in the thin spring sunlight, Nell stood beside Silas, his arms still bound but his eyes clear, and watched the crowd of valley folk who'd traveled to Cheyenne to see the verdict for themselves begin to celebrate, quiet and disbelieving at first, then louder, the sound of it carrying up into a sky finally free of storm clouds. Spring came to the valley slower than usual that year, the snows lingering late in the shadowed places. But when it finally arrived, it arrived thorough, green pushing up through the last patches of gray slush, the whole valley waking up at once, like it had been holding its breath through the winter, same as everyone in it. Nell reclaimed her old property that April, walking the burned foundation of her cabin with Silas beside her, the two of them saying little as they surveyed what was left, the blackened stones, the frame of a chimney still standing against the sky like a marker of everything that had happened there. She didn't rebuild the cabin. She'd thought about it in the early days after the trial. But standing there among the ashes, she'd understood that this particular piece of ground wanted to become something bigger than one woman's house. Instead, she built a schoolhouse, not a small one, not the single cramped room she'd taught in before Blackwood's men burned her books, but a real schoolhouse, wide and sturdy, with enough room for every child in the valley, regardless of what family they'd come from, what language their parents spoke at home, what color their skin was, or how thin their pockets ran. She'd insisted on that from the first day of planning. And Silas, who understood better than most what it meant to build a place of refuge, had backed her without a moment's hesitation, using what remained of Ironwood's restored finances to help fund lumber and glass and the careful work of raising walls strong enough to last generations. They built it on the border between her old property and Ironwood land, a deliberate choice. A symbol neither of them needed to explain out loud. Two pieces of ground, two lives, meeting in the middle to build something that would outlast either of them. The town showed up to help raise the frame. The way towns sometimes finally do, once they've remembered what they're capable of, when they stop being afraid of each other. Ruth Callahan brought her children to help nail shingles. Cora organized the women into shifts feeding the workers. The same women who'd once sat in a root cellar, comparing falsified ledgers, now standing together in the spring sun, laughing over something one of the children had said. Free in a way none of them had been in years. Dell and Marcus framed the schoolhouse door together, arguing good-naturedly over the level of the hinges. And nobody in that valley thought twice anymore about who was working beside whom. Nell stood at the edge of the yard one afternoon near the end of the building, a paintbrush in her hand, working carefully at the sign that would hang above the schoolhouse door, Ironwood School. It read simple letters in careful black paint, and beneath it, smaller, a line she'd insisted on, including even though Silas had teased her gently about the sentiment. Every child welcome, every mind worth teaching. She was still working on the final letter when she felt him come up behind her, the particular quiet of his footsteps she'd learned to recognize over the past year. The same careful stillness he carried into every room. "It's good work," he said, looking at the sign. "It's not finished yet. Feels finished enough to me." He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, both of them looking up at the schoolhouse together, at the fresh paint and the sturdy frame and the promise of everything it represented. "You did this, all of it. Started with a page a little girl saved from a fire, and ended with this. We did this," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without you risking everything you had." "I didn't risk it," he said. "I invested it. Best investment I ever made." He glanced sideways at her, something warm and unguarded in his expression. The same look she'd first noticed months ago in that narrow alcove behind the bank vault, when neither of them had a name yet for what was growing between them. "Ranch is worth more now than it was before I mortgaged it. Land's worth more when it's got a purpose behind it. Same as a man. I've come to think." Nell set down her paintbrush and turned to face him fully, wiping a smear of black paint from her fingers onto her apron. "What purpose is that, Mr. Thorne?" "Building something that lasts," he said. "Something worth defending. I spent 10 years thinking that was just land and cattle and fences." He reached out and took her paint-stained hand in his, the same careful, deliberate grip he'd used the first time he'd bandaged her wounds. Back when they were still strangers circling each other with more caution than trust. "Turns out it was never really about the land. What was it about then?" "You," he said simply. "Finding somebody who wouldn't break, no matter what got thrown at her. Somebody who taught me that the strongest thing a person can build isn't a fortress. It's a place where everybody's got room to stand." Nell felt her throat tighten, not with grief this time, not with the old familiar ache of loss she'd carried through most of the past year, but with something lighter. Something that had been building quietly under all the fear and the fighting and the long, cold winter, finally ready to be spoken out loud. "I love you," she said, because there wasn't any reason left to wait. No danger left to survive first. No proof left to gather before she let herself say it plainly. "I think I have for a while now. I just didn't have the words free to say it until everything else was finished." "I love you too," Silas said, and there was nothing rough or reluctant in the way he said it. None of the careful reserve she'd first known in him. "Have since you stood in that snow and wouldn't cry for men who wanted to break you. Been trying to earn the right to say it ever since." He kissed her there in the shadow of the schoolhouse they'd built together, gentle and unhurried. The kind of kiss that came after a year of proving to each other exactly what kind of people they were. And around them, the sounds of the valley carried on. Hammers still striking somewhere down the yard. Children laughing as they chased each other through the new grass. The whole town slowly remembering what it felt like to build instead of merely survive. That evening, as the sun set gold and low over the Wyoming plains, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose, Nell stood at the schoolhouse door with Silas beside her, looking out over land that had seen fire and grief and a hard, bitter winter, now settling quietly into spring, somewhere behind them. Cora's laughter carried on the breeze, mixed with the voices of children who would grow up in a valley, finally free of Blackwood's shadow. Learning their letters in a school, built from ashes and stubborn hope, they stood there together, equal partners who had walked through fire to reach this quiet moment and understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next, they would face it the same way. They'd faced everything since that first terrible morning in the snow. Together, the story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations. And so as the sun settles over the wide Wyoming Valley, we leave Nell Vance and Silas Thorne standing before a schoolhouse built from ashes, courage, and stubborn hope. What began as a cruel morning in the snow, with a widow watching her books burn and her life scattered across the frozen ground, became something far greater than one woman's fight for justice. It became the story of a whole valley learning how to stand again. Nell lost nearly everything. She lost her home, her work, her husband, and for a time, even the truth about his death. But the one thing Judge Blackwood and his men could never take from her was the fire inside her heart. They could burn her schoolbooks, but they could not burn the lessons she had already planted in the minds of those children. They could steal land, twist numbers, and frighten honest people into silence, but they could not destroy what truth becomes when one brave soul is willing to speak it aloud. That is the deepest lesson this story leaves behind. Real strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength looks like a woman standing in the snow, refusing to cry in front of men who want to break her. Sometimes it looks like a rancher lowering his gun, choosing justice over revenge. Sometimes it looks like a group of frightened townspeople gathering in a root cellar, comparing their pain until they realize they were never alone. And sometimes, strength is simply choosing to build again, after the world has tried its hardest to leave you in ruins. Silas Thorne teaches us that a good man is not measured by the size of his ranch, the sharpness of his gun, or the fear he can command. A good man is measured by what he is willing to protect. He had every reason to stay quiet. He had already suffered at Blackwood's hands. He had already rebuilt his life once from the ground up. But when he saw Nell standing alone, he understood that silence would make him no better than the men who looked away. His courage was not born from anger alone. It was born from purpose. He risked Ironwood not for pride, not for glory, but because some things are worth more than land, cattle, or money. Some things are worth risking everything for. And Nell reminds us that grief does not have to be the end of a story. For 2 years, she carried sorrow for a husband she thought had left her by accident. When she discovered the truth, that grief became a lantern, it lit the path forward. She did not let her pain turn her cruel. She let it make her brave. She did not seek justice only for Arthur. She sought it for Cora, for Ruth, for the children, for the widows, for the farmers, and for every person who had been made to believe their suffering was their own fault. That is what injustice does. It isolates people. It convinces each victim that they are alone, that their loss is shameful, that their voice is too small to matter. But the moment those people began to speak together, Blackwood's power began to crumble. His empire was not defeated by bullets. It was defeated by truth, memory, testimony, and unity. The story shows us that evil often survives because good people suffer separately. But when the wounded stand together, even the strongest tyrant begins to fall. The schoolhouse at the end is more than a building. It is a symbol. It stands where fire once tried to erase knowledge. It stands between Nellis' old life and Silas's land, joining two wounded hearts into one shared future. It tells every child who walks through its door that they are worthy of learning, worthy of dignity, and worthy of a place in the world. Every child welcome, every mind worth teaching. Those words are not only for the children in the story, they are for anyone who has ever been told they were too poor, too powerless, too broken, or too late to begin again. In the end, Nell and Silas do not simply win against Blackwood. They prove that love is not just romance beneath a western sunset. Love is protection. Love is partnership. Love is standing beside someone when the storm comes. Love is helping them carry the truth when it is too heavy to carry alone. Their love grows not from easy words, but from shared sacrifice, earned trust, and the choice to keep building even after loss. So if this story leaves us with one final message, it is this: the world may burn what you own, but it cannot burn what you know. It may take your house, but it cannot take your purpose. It may silence you for a season, but truth has a way of surviving in hidden ledgers, saved pages, brave hearts, and voices that refuse to stay buried. And somewhere out there, beyond the last ridge and the fading gold of the plains, there is always another ironwood waiting to be built, a place where the broken can stand, where the forgotten can be seen, and where justice, however delayed, finally rides home.